So today I would like to speak a bit about the work that myself and my colleague Rita Verna did, which is also an intersection between what GDP actually means, the growth dogma, and I guess the culpabilities of organizations like the IMF and like the World Bank, for example. So the dogma suggests that the trickle-down theory has been the only way and should be the only way for us to experience any qualitative and quantitative enhancement to our life chances, to our quality of life, and so forth. And I see the trickle-down theory as the sort of the evil twin of the GDP, which I've spent a couple of years with my colleagues critiquing. And what I would like to suggest is that rather than trickling down and hoping that the benefits of the largesse of corporate leftovers are going to somehow reach the most dispossessed, the most oppressed, the most colonized, the most racialized people in the world, the most socially and economically excluded and peripheralized, that rather the state needs to invest in a bottom-up approach, a pouring up approach, which is intentional. So what has happened is over the last 10, 15, 20 years, of this neoliberal dogma, we've had the situation where the life outcomes of many Black and brown women across the world have been mediated and have been taken to the altar of neoliberal capitalism with the expectation that somehow not only are our lives an infinite gift to free market neoliberal capitalism, but that in this dehumanizing matrix, that our lives are going to be not only infinitely available, but are infinitely only of value to the extent to which we are able to provide cheap, unpaid, or sometimes even, dangerous labor to this neoliberal dogma. The crisis of capitalism, of course, is one that we've all seen over the last few years, and the COVID pandemic was an important moment, almost an important corralling point around this, where we could see that the most marginalized became more marginal, and that where we could see that corporate interests conflated and gathered in order to create vaccines, to create value, and to apportion this value by suggesting that through, what can only be described as vaccine racism and vaccine colonialism, that Black lives were indeed not as important as white lives. In fact, what this means, it shows us that the growth dogma has been a failure. And the GDP, the research that we've done with Oxfam and many others, has shown that GDP in and of itself is not sufficient. And most of us are well aware that GDP doesn't measure the things that are really important. It doesn't measure growth in the ways of growth of the things that are most important. And many of the alternatives that we looked at were also false alternatives. So many of them to begin continuously hope that the GDP is going to be the residual anchor for growing economies and for providing alternatives. Of the many alternatives that we did look at, dozens or even hundreds of them, many of those, very few of them, can be viewed as decolonial in the context of being of the people who are most marginalized, in the voice of the people who are most dispossessed, and in fact with them having had a qualitative input into that. And that would be the model that comes out of Aotearoa, currently known as New Zealand, which had a consensus building process with community members of representatives of Aotearoa to determine what is a good life. And this is the question that we are asking. What has a good life been in the era of Reaganomics and Thatcherism, which suggests that there is no other way? What has a good life have been in the context of this crisis of capitalism, which has been engineered primarily by the IMF and the World Bank? What is a good life in the context, for example, of countries which are highly indebted, odiously indebted to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, to the extent where states can no longer be states? We have to talk about debt cancellation, where states are no longer able to do the things that states do, like providing qualitative education, like providing qualitative healthcare, like providing basic services like water and electricity. Now, if we consider what the role of a state is, then it's clear that many African states have been disenfranchised in their identity and in their capacity to be viable social partners and viable protectors of all of their citizens and all of their residents. The other thing is that we have to also think around what the debates are around social protection and the invisibilization of Black and brown women's labor in the midst of this. So because the trickle down suggests that eventually the benefits of neoliberal capitalism are going to arrive onto this massive population. And of course, this has not happened, and it's not designed to happen. It's not designed to happen in a context where most multinational companies and corporates extract any benefit to states through tax holidays, tax breaks, and through extractive processes like double taxation and double invoicing, for example. So we're aware that for every dollar that arrives on this continent, 3 actually leave this continent. No coincidence then that there is really a debate to be had on this continent, and no coincidence that this is happening in Africa. This meeting is happening in Africa, where we have to look and rethink what aid actually means in this context and who is indebted to whom. The fact that, of course, we also have a GDP that doesn't measure and think around the instrumentalization of colonialism, of settler colonialism, of settler capitalism as a mechanism through which many minority world countries, so-called the global north, have managed to grow their economies through the extraction of African people from this continent to many other worlds, through the extraction of resources and minerals, and through the ongoing extraction, for example, of labor, of knowledge resources, of capital resources, of intellectual resources as well. So this matrix of neoliberal capitalism is one within which the GDP is strongly embedded. And if, as I say, the GDP and the trickle-down theory are actually synonymous, are actually symbiotically aligned, it does seem that, in fact, the work that many of us are doing around reframing alternatives is not only a pleasant hobby, it's not merely a nice to have. It means that it seems that it's an inevitable means, it's an inevitable mechanism of shifting from these regressive ways of thinking around the economy to those which are more redistributive, that think around redistributive economics, reparative economics, and restorative economics, in fact. And in fact, the research that myself and Ritu did actually indicates that one of the most obstructive factors in trying to think around alternatives, in trying to think around new ways of being and new ways of imagining, are institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So what to do? The one is to perhaps rethink, institution building, and to rethink the sorts of formations which are able to then take us forward. It's clear that these sorts of the Bretton Woods compendium of institutions do not work in the interests of African people, Asian people, Latin American people, of the non-white world. These are actually extensions through their practices and their policies of white supremacist, white patriarchal supremacist assumptions about the sort of labor that can be infinitely extracted from Black and brown people and Black and brown women, and the fact that they are on the value chain of benefits, of profits, and of assets, the least considered. And it's a constant extractiveness. The second is to rethink and to think around the sort of feminist formations, especially from the global south of the majority world, who have been making demands for some time around what this could look like. So in 2020, in fact, a group of feminists amongst myself amongst them, drafted a letter to the then African Union envoys who were tasked to go and look for COVID money for the African continent by the then chair, President Cyril Ramaphosa. And these demands really speak again to the fact that trickle-down has failed, structural adjustment has failed, and continues to fail in all of its new permutations, whether it's called austerity, it continues to fail. It speaks to the fact that climate change is actually a colonial question. And again, it's important to show solidarity with the people here in Morocco who are at the back end of this. again, the people who are the least culpable are the ones who bear the burden the most. The same could be done about the recent floods in Pakistan. The same could be said about the earthquakes in Libya, and the same could be said about the ongoing flooding in Zimbabwe and Mozambique over the last 12 to 18 months. The third, of course, is also to rethink the role of the United Nations. And for some, it's considered the least problematic of many problematic institutions. Is there scope there? And I think the Secretary General has been saying interesting things around that GDP is no longer as effective as it should be. And of course, it goes without saying that the GDP was never designed to be effective. But in as much as the United Nations is problematic, could it be part of the vocabulary in terms of its global gravitas of bringing, of suggesting and influencing new ways of being? And then the fourth is also to think about the role of transnational companies and corporations and to call them out systematically. Again, it cannot be that they are companies, transnational companies, which have the same locus standi or even more in international courts of tribunal and trade tribunal as states, and of course oftentimes have far more resources than states, so that are able to leverage their will over states in terms of promoting their own very narrow capitalist agenda. And lastly, the role of other instruments like credit ratings agencies, who I think again have a very deeply problematic and democratic role in fomenting and influencing the ways that countries are perceived, the ways that certain economies are perceived, in politicizing economic issues, in getting into the very muddy waters sometimes, and sometimes unethical waters of using websites and using people's movements and people's community insurrections as a measure of inherent instability in ways that, again, are deeply racialized, unethical, and deeply problematic. So I think in closing, it's fair to say that there are alternatives. They are alternatives that look at, for example, the ways in which social services should be expended and redistributed, the way we need to redefine what work actually is and what dignified work is, the ways in which we need to rethink, for example, that what is dignified and what is ethical and context specific is very important. So, we cannot keep on generalizing a good life and growth and assuming that what works in Norway is going to work in Lesotho, what works in India is going to work in Canada, what works in Argentina is going to work in Libya, and what works in Samoa is going to also work in Cuba. It cannot be. So I think that, again, this northern-centric view of the world, which many of the alternatives also speak to a very narrow northern-centric, Eurocentric way of viewing the world, themselves can be part of the problem. But I think if we can be critical in our thinking, perhaps we can begin to continue growing this movement of alternatives to GDP until they're no longer alternatives, but until they are indeed the mainstreams, part of the multiple streams and multiple polar ways of viewing the world from a decolonized feminist perspective. Thank you.